Okay, Merry Christmas! It is time for my next favorites video. Today we are doing favorites by genre. So this is something that I've seen other booktubers do and it looked like a whole lot of fun. Rather than rating my favorite books by author or favorites of the year or least favorites of the year, today we're specifically categorizing my favorite books from each genre that I've read throughout 2020. Now, I want to give a special shout out to the Christmas books that I plan to read in December, in this month, as well as More Happy Than Not by Adam Silvera. This is an LGBTIQ plus contemporary. The reason I'm doing that is because those are the only books that I still have to read for the rest of the year. They will not be counted in my stats, nor in my favorites, because I have not read them. But as to the others, we have quite a list to get through, so let's get right into it. I'm going to be doing this in alphabetical order so that things are a little more even. Let's begin. My first category is contemporaries. Now these are everyday books that follow the lives of everyday human people doing human things. Some contemporaries can be rather easy to get through and others can be rather hard-hitting with very hard-hitting topics that we are dealing with. I read 10 contemporaries in 2020 and my favourite of all of them was this book, Letters to the Lost by Bridget Kemmerer. This is a YA contemporary and it is dual perspective following the lives of two people, Juliet and Declan. So at the beginning of this book we meet Declan, who is a teenager whose job it is to mow the lawns in a cemetery, but before he can do that he needs to move away the personal possessions. One day while moving possessions away from one of the graves he spies a letter. He reads this letter, which is written from a daughter to a mother. He loves everything that's written there, can relate to it, and responds to it. Little does he know, this letter is written by Juliet, the other perspective we're following. Needless to say, when Juliet returns to her mother's grave and sees that someone has not only read her letter but responded to it, she's a little bit outraged. Fair enough. But they end up having an anonymous back and forth. Both Juliet and Declan have gone through some really tough things in their lives and they're able to help each other through this anonymous letter writing that they do. This is an amazing book. It deals with a lot of hard contemporary topics, so please do be warned going in that we are dealing with grief and loss. We are dealing with criminal activity. We are dealing with fostering. We're dealing with really tough topics that Bridget Kemmerer brings up, but the book itself is absolutely amazing. I also want to give a very quick shout out to 13 Reasons Why and also The Devil Wears Prada. My next category is dystopians, and I read 13 dystopians in 2020. For those of you who don't know, basically dystopians are worlds that are generally being run by tyrants. Generally speaking, we have some sort of a class/caste, C-A-S-T-E system within this world, and because of this, there is a ton of discord, disharmony, all those sorts of things, but the world building in dystopians is generally quite fascinating if it is written well. My favourite dystopian for 2020 would have to be Divergent. The world in the world of Divergent that Veronica Roth has created is absolutely amazing. It is run by these head honchos who has split the world that our protagonist Tris Pryor lives in into different factions that are ruled by a personality trait, whether it be selflessness, intelligence, honesty. There's many different categories, and when you become of age in this world you choose what faction you want to belong to. I loved that too. You choose which faction you want to belong to. No one tells you where to go. You choose it yourself. You can remain in the faction you were born in with your parents, or you can go somewhere else. If you choose to go somewhere else, there is a saying that they have in this world, which is faction before family. So if you do transfer, your new faction and everyone in that faction comes first before the family. And the factions do generally tend to stick to themselves. I love this world. I love the setup. It was just absolutely amazing and I highly recommend it. I do also need to give a shout out to The Selection by Kiera Cass. It's called a dystopian because there's a lot of discord and disharmony among the residents of this world, Ilya, because of the class/caste system. And the Hunger Games as well. I loved getting to know dystopians as a genre. I did not know of the dystopian genre prior to 2020, and I've walked away loving the majority of the dystopians I read and hope to read a ton more in 2021. And now we get on to the big mama of them all, fantasy. I read 49 fantasies in 2020. I wish I could read one more. In fact, I'm doing a reread of a fantasy book right at the end of the year, so if that counts, then that will make it 50. But yeah, pretty massive. It's safe to say I was very heavily invested in fantasy, the most out of all genres. So for those of you who don't know, fantasies are, well, the fantasy genre is split into many different subgenres, but the two most common are low fantasy and high fantasy. Low fantasy exists in our world, but with magical elements. An example of that is Harry Potter. High fantasy are worlds that are made up by the author themselves. They don't exist in our world with, again, fantastical elements. Most often, especially in my experience, fantasy books will include magic systems, but that's not always the case. The number one book that I read that was a fantasy for me this year was Words of Radiance. The reason why I love this book is not necessarily because it is an epic fantasy, but rather because this book had me experiencing every single emotion under the sun. Happiness, sadness, joy, anger, humor, you name it. I experienced everything reading this book. It is 1,200 pages long, but it is 1,200 pages of sheer and utter joy and contentment. I loved this book so much. Special shout out to Mistborn: The Final Empire. The final book I'm going to give a shout out to is book 2 in this series, which is The Well of Ascension. Loved my fantasy, and those are my top 3 by that genre. My next genre we're going to talk about is historical fiction. Now, for those of you who don't know, historical fiction is exactly what the name makes it sound like. Books that are fiction that are set back in the past. I read 3 historical fictions this year. The first one is Once by Morris Gleitzman. I was not a fan of this book. The second one was The Book Thief. I was not a fan of this book either. And I pretty much was ready to just say, historical fiction is not for me. But then, the Murphy Napier Buddy Read Book of the Month a couple of months ago was this book, The Shadow of the Wind by Carlos Ruiz Zafón. This book was absolutely amazing. And this book has convinced me to keep going with my historical fiction trailblazing. We have an amazing journey along the way. This, my opinion, I believe, is an unpopular opinion. I think this is just a very polarizing book in that fact that some people really love it and some people really don't love it, but Carlos Ruiz Zafón had me really wanting to keep going with historical fiction, so I have to praise his name for that. Unfortunately, Carlos Ruiz Zafón passed away in June this year, so may he rest in peace, but I hope to read at least one more of his works in 2021. The next genre we are going to discuss is horror. Now, for those of you who don't know, in my opinion, horror is a genre that is meant to freak you out, disgust you, make you want to leave the light on at night, and convince you that you are going to have a nightmare. However, just like with fantasy, apparently, I did not know this till recently, there are many subset genres for horror. So, yeah. Take that as you will and do with that what you want. But for me, if I'm going to pick up a horror, I want to be freaked out. That is the bottom line. I want to be convinced I'm going to have a nightmare. So I want to quickly talk to you about Pet Sematary. In March, I picked up another edition of this book, but I prefer this edition. And I read it, preparing to be scared, freaked out, and convinced that I was going to have a nightmare. That did not happen. I have been told many times since having read this book that this book is more a wonderful exploration of grief and loss as opposed to its horrific elements. People who have watched the film have told me the film is much scarier, but I wanted to be scared by the book. And then I had friends telling me, well, with a book, you're kind of limited to your own imagination, so a book can't scare you. And to anyone who tells you that, I say, nay sir, pick up this book, Cenote by Sean Horton. This book was everything I wanted. It was horrific. It was scary. It grossed me out. It made me want to leave the light on. It convinced me I was going to have a nightmare. I didn't, but I was convinced I was going to regarding the main antagonist of this novella. Sean Horton is an amazing writer. Oh my goodness, it is incredibly written. If you want a horror that's going to freak you out, if you want a horror that's going to scare you, read this book. And now, as you see an obvious change in my bookshelf, it is time to discuss the LGBTIQ plus books that I have read this year. I have read 4 LGBTIQ plus books this year, but again, a shout out to More Happy Than Not by Adam Silvera. I am literally about to start this book the moment I'm done recording this video, and this will be the final book I read for the year outside of my Christmas books. This is an LGBTIQ plus book as well, so this will make it 5. LGBTIQ plus books are, well, let's go through them. Lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, intersex, and queer, and many other things in between. This genre of books means a lot to me. It hits incredibly close to home as a proud gay man. It very much hits close to home, so I wanted to read a lot of LGBTIQ plus books this year. It did not happen. I wish that I'd read a lot more, and my goal for 2021 is to certainly do that. I want to, if I'm reading 5 this year, I want to at least double it and at least read 10 next year. I want to be able to fill a whole square with at least 10, 15, 20 LGBTIQ plus books. But my favourite LGBTIQ plus out of all the ones I've read this year is History Is All You Left Me by Adam Silvera. Adam Silvera is a gay man that was born and raised in the Bronx, and so it is Own Voices. This is a very interesting story. This book really is very raw and very real as far as discussing grief and loss, and also clinically diagnosed anxiety. Oh my goodness, Adam Silvera did a great job with that too. Adam Silvera wasn't writing a romance. He was writing a book that explores what happens when the romance is gone owing to a death, and having to process that grief when no one else understands it on the same level as you do. The other shout out that I do need to give is The Gravity of Us by Phil Stamper. The next genre we're going to talk about is literary fiction. So from my understanding, because this is what I have been told and I love this idea, so this is what I think of it as, literary fiction are works of fiction that are thought-provoking, that make you think about things rather than just going along for the ride and enjoying the plot of the book. These fictional works will bring up topics of discussion that you will walk away from the book and think about for a while. And I have 2 literary fictions that I've read this year. Up until in fact, last week I'd only read 1, and that was going to be in a favourites video, and still will be, but it's not going to be my favourite literary fiction, because even though I only read it a week ago, my favourite literary fiction is this book, The Boy, the Mole, the Fox and the Horse by Charlie Mackesy. This is a middle grade literary fiction, so it is mainly drawings and a couple of lines, and the lines are written in like a calligraphy kind of style, but every single page is so incredibly thought-provoking. This is such a beautiful book that can be appreciated for people of all ages. I feel like you could read this to children. I feel like you should read this to children, but even adults can appreciate this. I nearly cried so many times reading this book, because every time I thought that it couldn't get any more aww, like it did. So I will give you one example. There is a line in this book where the mole talks to the boy and says to the boy, "Do you view the glass as half full or half empty?" And the boy says to the mole, "I actually appreciate that I have the glass." I mean, oh, come on. And that's just one page. My other literary fiction that I read this year was My Dark Vanessa by Kate Elizabeth Russell. But The Boy, the Mole, the Fox and the Horse, everyone has to read this book. And if you cry, let me know. And even if you're a boy or a man, we're allowed to cry too. So if you're a boy or a man and you cried, that's totally fine. Let me know that you did, okay? Whew.